Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. We have a special show today. We're answering the philosophy professor that Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory in the series Young Sheldon confronts when he is a child. This is in the series Young Sheldon, and it's in season 4, episode 7, and it spills over into another episode, but it's mainly episode 7. You can find it on YouTube. It's rather infuriating and entertaining at the same time. So Sheldon is a genius. He's a young boy in this series. He's about 8 or 9, and he's starting college. So his first day in college, he has a philosophy class. The professor says to the class, "You don't even know what you think you know." The Chinese philosopher Zhuo believed it was possible he really didn't know anything because he might just be a butterfly, dreaming he was a philosopher. Sheldon raises his hand. "He wasn't a butterfly," says Sheldon. The professor says, "How do you know?" Sheldon responds, and you have to picture an 8 or 9-year-old boy saying this, "The butterfly's brain doesn't contain enough neurons to generate a complex dream." The professor says, "How do you know you're not just dreaming? Butterflies can't dream." Sheldon says, "Because I'm awake." And of course, you know what the professor says, "Or are you just dreaming you're awake?" Sheldon, "You can see I'm awake and you can hear me talking." The professor says, "I don't know. I saw pretty tricky stuff at a Grateful Dead concert. The drummer turned into a tap dancing walrus and floated away. So we can't trust our senses, can we?" Sheldon tries. "We can validate them by comparing them with other observers." Says the professor. "That would mean we would have to hear what they say, which would mean trusting our senses." Sheldon is stymied. He goes home. He's upset. After school, he goes finally to bed. He has a dream. He dreams that he meets Rene Descartes. And he asks Descartes, "So how do I get her to understand that science forms true beliefs about reality as it really is?" Descartes says, with a French accent, all dressed up as to look actually very, very much like our portraits of Descartes show him looking, "All knowledge must rest on a foundation that we can never doubt. And that is," and then Sheldon wakes up, but he says, "Exactly, that's it." And it was the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. To which the professor, when he goes to class, says, "Yes, you're exactly right. That does," let's all give Sheldon a hand. The class applauds, and she gives Sheldon a beautiful yellow flower. And he says, why are you giving me this?" And she says, "Because it's full of nectar. And you're a butterfly." And then Sheldon dreams that he is a butterfly with Sheldon's head. And then he wakes up. So he was dreaming not only that he talked to Descartes, but he was dreaming that he talked to the philosophy professor and she accepted his answer. And that would be correct. Descartes' answer is not an answer. Descartes says, "I can be deceived by I could be deceived if God were malevolent. He calls it an evil demon because it would be impious to believe that God would trick him. So he believes there's an evil demon. He could be deceived about anything. He says, even when I count the sides of a square or anything simpler, if anything simpler can be imagined, still, he says, in order to be deceived, I must be. So I know whatever errors that some super being might have put into my consciousness, I know that my consciousness is there because I can't be deceived if I don't exist. To which the answer is what? I mean, from the skeptic's point of view, skeptic believes there's no knowledge. Boy, the demon really fooled you that time. You think that's logical, but it isn't. Logic itself is something we put into your brain. And I say we now because you could change this to the matrix or to the brain in a vat. There are many modern updates of Descartes' idea of a malevolent force that is able to distort your consciousness and make you believe things and seem to see things that aren't actually there. So I think therefore I am fails. There's no therefore if something runs your brain, something other than you. So the philosophy professor would have been right in saying that that's no answer. He dreamed that she said that, but that's what she would have said. So Sheldon goes to meet with the philosophy professor. It's a woman, incidentally, and he tells her, I'm dropping your course. And she says, why? I didn't think you would admit defeat. And he said, oh, I'm not admitting defeat. I just decided this is not important. This philosophy stuff is not important. And she says, what is important? And he says, the acquisition of factual knowledge. Uh-oh, he's back in it. She says, and how do you know if something is factual? How do you know? He says, you test it confidently. You test it and see if it holds true. That answer comes from the logical positivist orientation from almost 100 years ago. The professor says, how do you know that that's factual? In other words, you think you tested, maybe it's all a dream. You think it came out true, maybe that's all a dream. You think that if it tests out as true, that's a reason to believe it. Maybe that's illogical, and God or a demon or just nature has put into your brain the belief to the contrary. So once you get into this, there's no getting out by playing their game. So what is the answer? How do we know? Well, fortunately, someone wrote a book entitled How We Know. And extra fortunately, that person was me. So let me tell you what the proper response, and we'll go through her arguments, the proper response is, and save Sheldon's mental health. Number one, the senses are beyond valid. The senses, informally, we would say they're valid, meaning there's no issue of trusting the senses. They're not invalid. You can't even say they're valid. Valid is something, valid refers to something that you can reduce to sensory perception. Sensory perception does not make any claims about anything. It's just awareness. There's no way to question the senses. Where would you stand in order to question the senses? Well, to question them, you have to raise a thought in your mind. Where did that thought come from? What is it composed of? It's composed of concepts. Every word you think of, are my senses valid? Are my senses valid? Every word there stands for an idea, for a concept. You weren't born with any language. You weren't born with any concepts. You developed them out of what? Ultimately out of sense observation and experience with the world directly through sense perception. So in order to raise a question of any kind, you have to rely on sensory material. You have to rely on your awareness through the senses of reality. So what about the floating walrus? She went to a Grateful Dead concert and she had an hallucination. She must have been on something. I mean, that's the way, this is fiction, but let's assume that that's true. What has that got to do with the senses? It's not that her senses told her that there was a floating walrus there. That was a hallucination. Perception is contact with reality, not interrupted by some chemical that stops the normal process of cognition. And even that hallucination of the walrus ultimately reduces to an experience of the way the chemical is interacting with your nervous system. So there's nothing in a hallucination to make you question your senses. Well, what about dreams? That was another issue. Couldn't we be dreaming and thinking that we're not dreaming? No. What is a dream? A dream is a state in which you're not in contact with reality and you can't think. Sure, words can go through your mind. I've even dreamt that I was having an argument about this very subject, and then I woke up. But what I actually dreamt was a picture of this subject, because I have images associated with all subjects. It's kind of vague for Descartes and skepticism, but I had a picture. And then I had certain feelings. I dreamt I was saying certain things, but I couldn't reproduce for you. So I had certain feelings that now I've answered him, the skeptic. And then I woke up. But you can't think in a dream. So you never think you're awake when you're not awake, because you don't think unless you're awake. But even that argument I just gave you, what if she says, well, how do you know that? Maybe you're dreaming that you're awake. How do you know everything isn't a dream? And this is a question that is not a real question. I don't mean that it's pointless. I mean, it's nonsense. It's incoherent. There is no question there. It's like this. What's the difference between a duck? That's not a question. It has the form of a question and the intonation of a question, but there's no question. What is the difference between a duck? Incidentally, the answer is one of his legs is alike. So to get to the stage of asking a question, a lot of things have to be assumed already established. You have to assume that you have language. You have to assume that you can think. You have to assume that you're in contact with reality through your senses. And if any of those weren't true, then you wouldn't be able to ask a question. So it's philosophers, or at least parody philosophers like this, think that they can say anything and you have to refute it. They think they can say, well, it's possible you're a butterfly. No, it isn't possible. What makes you say it's possible? The burden of proof is on the person, as I say in my book. The burden of proof is on the person who claims knowledge. And the philosophy professor is saying the Chinese philosopher believed it was possible. Really? He did? Even as, how do you know that? How do you know he believed it was possible? But let's say I believe it's possible. The professor didn't need to quote a Chinese philosopher. She could have said, just, it's possible that you don't know anything because you might just be a butterfly, right? That's a claim to certain condition, to a certain state of affairs. It's possible. But possible is not an epistemological free lunch. To say something is possible, you must have evidence. Not much evidence, but if a thing does not have any evidence, it is not possible. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It means that it's empty of cognitive content. It's as though nothing were said. So somebody could say, well, it's possible that a meteor will strike me. Really? Why? What makes you think? Well, meteors strike places. That's not evidence that enough for me to say that it's possible that a meteor might strike me. It's possible that I'm hallucinating this. Really? Why? What's your evidence? Well, people do have hallucination. That's not evidence. You might as well say it's possible that I will inherit a fortune from a relative living in Sheboygan who just died, and I don't know this relevant because it's possible that there was a scandal in my family. Someone had a child out of wedlock who was the ancestor of this never mentioned relative, but he's heard about me. It's possible, isn't it? And he's going to leave me $17 million plus a new Ferrari. Really? What's the evidence for that? None. I just made it up. I mean, Ferraris exist, money exists, relatives. That's not evidence that this is a hypothesis I should form. So the burden of proof is on the person who claims knowledge. Let me read from the book here. One doesn't need a reason not to consider something a fact. One doesn't need a reason not to consider something a fact. One doesn't need a reason not to entertain something as a hypothesis. And that's what you're doing when you're saying maybe, it's possible. The reverse is true. The burden of proof is on him who claims knowledge. Knowledge is an effect of the operation of certain causes. For the effect to be present, the causes must have been present. Ignorance, not knowledge, is the default condition. Thus, a claim to have achieved knowledge, even knowledge of possibility, must be supported by showing that the cause was present and operative. The cause of knowledge is awareness, direct perception of the thing, or awareness of evidence logically supporting it. In the absence of such awareness, the claim to know is arbitrary and thus is to be dismissed, not refuted like Descartes tried to do. Dismissed. It's empty. It's mere words, a spouting of words that have no connection to reality. So that's the first thing. So going back now, or it's the second thing. The first thing is the senses are the basis of deciding what's valid and what's invalid. The basis of all knowledge is the senses, which cannot be wrong. They're never wrong. Your senses are never wrong. Of course, the reason why they aren't is they're never right either. They just present you with information. You get what you get. You see what you see. You have to judge it, but that's not an operation of the senses. Okay, so going back to this. It's possible you don't know anything because you might just be a butterfly dreaming. Okay? It's possible you don't know anything because, wait a minute. If I don't know anything, where does because come from? Where do you start saying, oh, and here's my reasons for you don't know anything. Now, here's my mouse. Okay. If I say, you don't know anything to my mouse, which doesn't know anything, I don't have to explain because you don't have any neurons. It can't hear me. It's not conscious, right? So if the professor thought that Sheldon was like my mouse, unconscious, insentient, inanimate matter, it would have been pointless to say it's possible you're dreaming it or it's possible that you don't know anything. No, it's actual you don't know anything. But to say, now let's make the hypothesis you don't know anything. Here's the reason why you don't know anything, because you're a butterfly. No, the hypothesis is that you're stone cold unconscious. Okay, so, moving on. Sheldon says after she says that, it's possible, which is not possible. He really didn't know anything because there's no, well, of course I have to give her credit, the writers. You can say about another person, it's possible you don't know anything because you don't have any neurons, but not because you're dreaming that you know something. But the mouse can't hear me and can't say, oh, good point. So Sheldon says he wasn't a butterfly. And the professor says, how do you know? How do you know? Now, that question is legitimate unless you're asking it about everything. How do you know anything is a request for knowledge. What are the facts that you are aware of that make you aware of facts? And I'm going to then shoot that down. Skepticism is self-refuting and is not to be entertained. Skepticism is the doctrine that man knows nothing. Now, it's still 100% skeptical if he says, well, maybe man knows nothing. Maybe I don't know anything. Anything that cannot be discussed. No discussion is possible with an insentient thing. No discussion is possible with a fish who does have some form of perceptual awareness probably and has learned certain things, so we can assume that it has a perceptual level knowledge. Certainly dogs do, cats do. So you can't expect your dog to respond to, maybe you're dreaming now, maybe you don't. To make communication of ideas with somebody that you're saying, maybe you don't have any ideas, is a contradiction. It's an impossible thing. You can't do it. So how do you know, as a request for, how do you know this one thing on the basis, what earlier facts do you know that would show this to be a fact? That's a fine question. But she goes on to say, when he says the butterfly's brain doesn't contain enough neurons to generate a complex dream, how do you know you're not just dreaming? Butterflies can't dream. How do you know you're not? You don't have to prove that anything that someone makes up is false. They have to prove that anything they say is true, or at least has some evidence for it. Sheldon says he knows he's not dreaming because he's awake. Or are you just dreaming you're awake? Says the professor, which is to put forward it's possible. There's a possibility here you have to consider. You have to consider the possibility that you can't consider anything. No, that's incoherent. Sheldon says, you can see I'm awake and you can hear me talking, which is a good answer, actually. And her answer to that is, well, they're hallucinations. How do you know you're not hallucinating? What's your evidence that I'm hallucinating? Well, people hallucinate. That's not evidence that I'm hallucinating. People pole vault. People fish. That doesn't mean maybe I'm now pole vaulting or maybe I'm fishing. So it has to be about me if you're talking to me and putting forward this possibility. And then Sheldon says, unfortunately, when she says, so we can't trust our senses, can we? We can validate them by comparing them with other observers. And then she points out that's circular. Of course, she has no basis for thinking circular reasoning is wrong. She has no basis for anything. So I want to spend the final moments on the most important thing, which is the validity or the beyond validity of the senses. Senses as a standard of what's valid. One argument is against the senses is the argument from hallucination or delusion, which I already answered. That's not the senses. That's a chemical acting on the brain. There are two other arguments in favor of, well, I mean, there would be arguments if they weren't attacking the basis of all giving of arguments. One is the argument from illusions, optical illusions. Well, you know, a straight stick put in water at a certain angle looks bent. And in a yellow light, blue looks black. And you can go on the web and look up optical illusion and see fantastic illusions. Yes, but that's not any problem with the senses. A camera would also photograph the same thing you see with your eye in either case. Where the error is if you look at that stick in water and say, that's a bent stick. But that's an error of your conceptual judgment. It's not an error in perception. There's nothing wrong with your eyes. Doctor, you've got to do something to help my eyes. What's the problem? I see a straight stick in water is bent. Yeah, well, that's the way the right light refracts. That's something you should be seeing. That's the way a straight stick looks, the doctor says, when it's half submerged in water and it put at a certain angle to you because of the way light waves travel, slower through water than through air. So it's not an attack on the senses. It's an attack on a conclusion drawn from the senses. And it's, you know, we can analyze when and why you tend to think something is other than you see it is in the fuller context, but it's not a problem with your senses. Your senses are looking at that stick, are not saying, hey, buddy, that's a bent stick, you know. They're not saying anything. So the senses are mute, as J.L. Austin, a 20th century English philosopher, correctly stated. The senses are mute. They do not tell you things. And the formula for any illusion is our senses are telling us X, but X is not the case. And no, our senses never tell us anything. The most you can say is the senses present something that looks in one set of circumstances like other things look in different circumstances. In other words, the stick semi-submerged in water looks very similar to how a bent stick out of water looks. Yeah. And a person might look very much like his brother. So you might leap to the conclusion, oh, there's Joe. No, wait, it's not Joe. Maybe you never learned. It wasn't Joe, it was his brother Bill. Even a twin brother. So things can look like other things. That is not a problem of the senses. That's the senses working correctly. Except you can't even say correctly. Working as they have to. They're physical instruments. They respond according to the law of physical causality. There's no way that they can whisper in your ear a lie. And you know, all these attackers on the senses say the senses have once deceived you, means you can never trust them again. But your senses never deceived you. Deceit is an action of a person uttering statements like, no, my son Hunter earned that money. Or, I really won that election and there was massive fraud. So I want to alienate both sides, the Biden side and the Trump side here, because they're both wrong. The third argument, so we got the argument from hallucination. The answer is it's not the senses, it's the brain. And the argument from illusion. The third one is the argument from the relativity of perception. And that is best illustrated with, you put your left hand in cold water, you put your right hand in hot water, you let them get adapted, then you take them out and put both of them in lukewarm water, in the same bucket of lukewarm water. The hand that's cold adapted will feel the water's warm. The hand that's adapted to the heat will feel the water's cold. But the water can't be both hot and cold at the same time. So this one, at least one of the senses are wrong. And more generally, the way we perceive is determined by our nervous system. If our nervous system were different, we perceive differently. So we never perceive reality as it really is. Only reality as our senses present it. That's called the argument from the relativity of perception. It's relative to your physiological equipment, the nature of your sense of receptors and your nervous system, etc. But the answer to that is what's called the form-object distinction. The way you perceive depends upon the nature of your sense organ. What you perceive, the object, does not. And all ways of perceiving are valid. None of them are wrong. It's like French is not the wrong language. Spanish is not the right language. Right and wrong are, right and wrong are not applicable to different ways of talking about reality. And in the same way, the form in which you experience the water may be different. So your internal experience of the two hands is different. But the fact that you're experiencing is one fact, and you are experiencing it. That's the way lukewarm water feels to a cold hand, and that's the way lukewarm water feels to a hot hand. Your senses, as you probably know, are responding to the outflow of heat, the conduction of heat away, not to the absolute temperature. So you might say, well, but my senses are giving me a temperature that's not there. And your senses don't give you temperature, they give you heat flow. And the heat flow is as you experience it. Whatever experience you have is caused by something. It's not caused by nothing. It's not caused by an evil demon inside you. And it is an awareness of that something. Your mind has to figure out what it is and how it relates to the other things that you've been aware of. So the main thing, your only ultimate contact with reality is not through an argument like, well, I must exist if I'm deceived, but through, here's a hand. Here's a sound. Here's a sound. What you can be aware of through your senses is the base of everything, and you don't have to trust them. There's no possibility of them feeding you a reality out of some kind of malevolent choices they make. They don't make choices. They're physical instruments and can only record what they do. Now, record is a bad word. Respond in the way that they do. Okay, so Sheldon was wrong to entertain the argument. He should have said, if you're going to admit the arbitrary, the evidenceless, the maybe, the why not into discussion, then you've departed from reality and I have nothing to learn from you. And there's no answer to that because she says blah, blah, yada, yada in answer to it. And I say blah, blah, yada, yada, because it's a variable. Whatever she says, she's saying on the premise that she is conscious, that existence exists, and that Sheldon is conscious and can hear it and understand it. So I'll end with this thing I learned from my students. One of the very first courses I taught in philosophy, it was at Pratt Institute. And I gave an exam, final exam. How can we know before even hearing it that any attack on the senses is wrong, is contradictory, is invalid? And I wanted the kind of material that I've been giving you today, but not the detail, just that the senses are the foundation of everything, of all knowledge. And one student wrote, well, if your senses weren't valid, you couldn't hear the argument. How do you know before hearing it that you couldn't hear it unless you can hear? And I thought, gee, that's pretty good. And it comes up in reverse in this Young Sheldon when she says, that would mean we would have to hear what they say, which would mean trusting our senses for corroboration. I can get corroboration from other people. Well, you'd have to hear them. That means trusting your senses. How about my hearing you, Professor? I don't hear anything. Nobody said anything, did they? And you leave. So skepticism is a childish, stupid, contradictory, and ultimately meaningless, incoherent game that's played. It is not philosophy. It doesn't deserve an answer because the answer is assumed in thinking you can, the answer of the opposite of what they're saying is assumed when you listen to what they're saying and try to understand it, and you take them as existing. And there was once an objectivist who was asked, how do you know that I even exist? You're here and we're having this conversation. How do you know that I exist? I don't know that I exist. And the objectivist said, well, you better find out because I'd hate to be caught talking to myself. And that's all the seriousness that this amusing as a sitcom, but sick as a philosophy approach is. But that was a convoluted grammar. That's all this approach deserves, is a joke. And it's appropriate for a sitcom, but it's not appropriate for the classroom. Thank you very much. We have a question, at least one question, but it's not directly on this material. So let's take it up next Monday, that question and others that you have in Ask Harry Anything next Monday. Thank you for coming.